The desert wind howls across the ruins of ancient temples. The sands of Egypt whisper secrets buried for thousands of years, secrets not of gods or monuments, but of flesh, desire and power, secrets that have been erased from scrolls, silenced in tombs. And hidden beneath the golden mask of civilization, imagine a kingdom that glorified eternal life and divine order. Yet, behind the veil of grandeur, a darkness lingered. Intimate practices that today would chill the blood. Practices soaked not in love, but in control and ritual fear. The Nile flowed as a lifeline for millions, but within the palaces of pharaohs and the shadows of their priests, the river was also a witness to rituals so disturbing they were never meant to be remembered. We are told that ancient Egypt was the land of wisdom, medicine, and sacred order. But what happens when sacredness is twisted into obsession? What happens when the most private aspects of life become tools for power? A flicker of torchlight reveals a chamber. Beneath the great temple, hieroglyphs on the wall seem to praise fertility and life. But scholars who dared to decode them found something else. Stories of forced unions between priests and priestesses, acts performed not out of choice, but demanded. By ritual, a body was not one's own in these chambers. It belonged to the gods and to the men who claimed to speak for them. The pharaoh was not just a ruler, but a living god. His seed was seen as divine essence, which meant every act of intimacy carried a weight beyond imagination. He could take whom he desired, not as a man, but as a deity. Those chosen women rarely had a voice, for to resist was not to deny the king, it was to deny a god, and denial meant death. One tale whispers through the scrolls of the dead. A queen young and innocent married to the pharaoh as a mere political bond. Her nights were not her own. Each touch was documented by priests who claimed it was sacred duty. Yet in her eyes, history records only silence and silence. In Egypt was the sound of suffering. Not all practices were born in temples. Some took place in the shadow of death itself. When a noblewoman died, the embalming priests were forbidden to touch her immediately. Why? Because history holds accounts that some among them could not resist their darkest urges. The bodies of the dead became victims of unspeakable acts. So the law demanded that a corpse be left to decay for days before preparation. Rot became her shield against desecration. A truth historians whisper with trembling voices, a truth hidden beneath the incense of mummification. The more we uncover, the more chilling it becomes. Power was not only about armies and monuments. It reached into the bedroom, into the body, into the very core of what it meant to be human. There are accounts of rituals where intimacy was staged before entire courts, priests watching, scribes recording, claiming the union was sacred. But for the woman it was exposure, humiliation, and loss of dignity. Her body was a stage. Her pain was a ceremony. Even the gods demanded sacrifices that blurred the line between worship and cruelty. Isis, the goddess of magic and fertility, was honored through rites, where women were compelled to act out sacred unions. It was not choice, it was decree. What was divine to the crowd was torment to the chosen, and behind the walls of power, betrayal thrived. Brothers fought over sisters, uncles desired their nieces. Royal bloodlines were preserved through unions that broke every moral boundary. Incest was not taboo in the palace, it was policy. The gods demanded purity of blood, they said, but purity was another name for possession. A scribe wrote once of a princess who longed for freedom. She was offered as a bride to her own, a father, because in the eyes of the court, her body was a vessel to keep the line divine. Her tears never made it into the official record. But the fragments left behind speak of despair, of a child turned into property, of love twisted into power beneath. The golden masks and towering statues, there was fear. Fear for the powerless, fear for the enslaved. The slaves of Egypt were not only forced to build but forced to surrender even their most private selves. Historians have found evidence that women, servants within the palace, were kept not only to work but to satisfy the whims of their masters. They were stripped of dignity in the name of luxury, their cries buried in silence while history celebrated the glory of pharaohs. But even pharaohs were not safe from desire turned dark. One ruler, known only through whispers in papyri, was poisoned by his queen, a queen who had suffered years of ritual demands. Her revenge was born not of power, but of survival. And when his body was found lifeless, the scribes wrote of divine judgment, yet perhaps it was human pain finally breaking its chains. Each of these practices was wrapped in ritual and faith, but behind them were people, human beings, torn apart by the collision of desire, power, and control. The temple echoed with chants of holiness, while behind closed doors, it echoed with the silence of the violated. And yet history tried to bury these truths. Stone carvings glorified pharaohs as gods among men. Paintings showed harmony, fertility, and love. But what was carved in secret papyri tells another story, a story of domination of bodies, turned into tools of ritual of intimacy, turned into fear. As you listen to these whispers from the sands, imagine standing in the desert night. The pyramids rise against the stars, but beneath their weight lie the unheard voices of women and men who suffered unseen, their pain lost in the wind, their dignity traded for the illusion of divinity. The question lingers: was Egypt the cradle of civilization, or the cradle of sacred cruelty? And how much of history is built on silence? The silence of the desert grows heavier as we move deeper into the shadows of Egypt's past. Beneath the polished gold, the carved hieroglyphs and the divine chants lay the bruises of countless forgotten lives. Lives that never had the power to speak for themselves, yet their suffering carved itself invisibly into the fabric of history. We are told of the greatness of Ramses and Tutankhamun, of pyramids reaching toward eternity. But rarely do we hear of the women hidden within those walls. A concubine, forced to live in the harem of a pharaoh, was not a wife, not a partner, not even truly human in the eyes of the state. She was a possession, a vessel of pleasure, and a pawn for politics. Her smile on temple walls may seem divine, yet behind that smile lingered despair. The harem was a palace within a palace. It glittered with jewels, perfumes, and fine linens, but for those trapped inside, it was a golden prison. Every movement was watched, every breath controlled. A girl brought from foreign lands might have been promised luxury. Instead, she became part of a system where refusal meant punishment, humiliation, or disappearance. Her body became a battlefield where power was exercised, not love. And betrayal grew even here. History whispers of a harem conspiracy where wives and concubines plotted to murder the pharaoh. Why? Because within those walls, desire had become a weapon, and jealousy burned hotter than the desert sun. It was a world where survival meant playing the most dangerous of games, with life itself at stake. Beyond the palaces, another world of darkness unfolded. Festivals of fertility celebrated in the villages along the Nile. Crowds would gather, and priests proclaimed divine union between man and goddess. But what appeared to be ritual dances often masked something darker. Women from the common people, sometimes taken by force, were used to act out sacred roles before the eyes of strangers. The crowd cheered for fertility, while the chosen woman stood in silence. A silence heavy with shame. Her pain justified by faith, her dignity erased in the name of the gods. Even children were not free from the shadow. Some pharaohs demanded that their own daughters be offered to them in ritual unions because the blood of gods had to remain pure. What history calls tradition might better be called torment. What the priests carved as divine duty was nothing less than betrayal of innocence, and still the desert kept its secrets. It took centuries for scholars to uncover fragments that spoke of these horrors, Most were buried, destroyed, or rewritten by scribes loyal to the throne. But a few survived papyri hidden in forgotten tombs, whispers of women whose names were erased, yet whose pain could not be silenced entirely. One such fragment speaks of a ritual where a virgin was brought to the temple of Amun. Her body was declared property of the god, but the god did not descend. Instead, priests claimed the role. She was forced into acts that stripped away not only her dignity, but her very sense of self. In her final words recorded by a scribe, she begged the Nile to take her away, for in its waters she saw more mercy than in the hands of men who called themselves holy. This collision of faith and cruelty stretched. Across centuries, Egypt's greatness was built on devotion, discipline, and order. But that order often came at a human cost. It turned intimacy into performance, desire into power, bodies into symbols. And yet within this cruelty, there were moments of resistance. A servant who risked death to escape the palace, a queen who defied ritual and turned to poison, a concubine who whispered prayers into the night, begging that her suffering not be forgotten. They may have failed in life, but their stories live in fragments, in broken hieroglyphs, and in the hidden corners of history. As the desert wind erases footprints, so too did Egypt try to erase these truths. But the past has a way of speaking, and when it speaks, it demands we listen. So what do we learn from this silence now broken? That even the most celebrated civilizations hide shadows, that power, when unchecked, can twist the sacred into the horrific, that behind every golden mask might lie a face, wet with tears. The pyramids still rise. Against the sky, the temples still echo with chants of gods. But if you listen closely beneath the glory, you will hear something else. The sound of unheard voices, the cry of those who were silenced. And as we stand centuries away, the question returns. To us, how much of history is built not on wisdom, but on silence and pain? And how many stories still lie buried in the sands waiting to be uncovered? The legacy of Egypt is not only monuments, but a warning that when power takes control of intimacy, it leaves behind scars that last longer than stone. And if the past teaches us anything, it is this: civilizations rise and fall, but the human cost of silence never disappears. Thank you for walking this journey through the forgotten shadows of ancient Egypt. If this story moved you, remember that there are countless more voices waiting to be heard. Join us as we continue to uncover the mysteries history tried to bury. Subscribe to be part of this journey. Together, we will keep the silence broken and the truth alive.